I still remember the day he walked through my front gate, his smile wide, his voice trembling with affection, and his eyes glistening like a boy who'd just found his long-lost family. "Aunt Margaret?" he said, his voice soft but sure. "It's me, your brother Edward's son. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. The teacup in my hand rattled against its saucer. Edward, my younger brother, had died in a car crash 45 years ago. He was only 26 then, newly married, and his wife was said to have miscarried before vanishing out west. There was no child. At least, that's what we were told. So when this man appeared at my door, tall and handsome, in a crisp white shirt and old-fashioned brown coat, saying he was my nephew, my heart spun between disbelief and desperate hope. At 81, I'd long stopped expecting surprises, but something about his face, his sharp nose, the curve of his smile reminded me painfully of Edward. "Come in," I said, my voice shaking. "Come in, my dear." He entered quietly, almost reverently, glancing around my little house as though stepping into sacred ground. The air smelled of lavender polish and old wood. The same scent Edward used to joke made my house smell like Grandma's hug. "My mother told me about you," he said, setting down his worn-out leather bag. "She passed a few months ago. I found your letters in her chest, letters you wrote to my father. My knees went weak. I'd written Edward letters every month after he moved to Chicago, but after his death, I burned most of them except the last few he'd sent me. Those had stayed tucked inside a lace box under my bed, yellowed and fragile. This stranger, this nephew, knew about those letters. How could he? He spoke gently, respectfully, told me his name was Daniel, said his mother had never spoken much about our side of the family because she'd remarried after Edward died. He said she carried shame, guilt, and sorrow, and before she died, she made him promise to find me, to return to the family she'd lost. I listened, my heart tightening. Every word seemed soaked in sincerity. That night, I brought out my photo albums. We sat by the fireplace as the winter wind screamed outside. Daniel listened to my stories with tears in his eyes, how Edward had loved fishing at Willow Lake, how he once carved my initials on the barn door, how we danced at his wedding under strings of fairy lights. Daniel knew the names, the places, the little things only family could know. He even remembered our dog, Jasper. He was brown, right? With one white paw? I gasped. "Yes," I whispered. He smiled. Dad told me about him. My heart melted. For the first time in decades, I felt something warm blossom inside me, a sense of belonging I hadn't realized I'd lost. He stayed the night in the guest room. By morning, he'd made me breakfast, pancakes, and bacon, the same way Edward used to cook when we were kids. He moved about my kitchen like he'd lived there forever. Over the next few weeks, Daniel became part of my daily life. He helped fix the squeaky fence, carried groceries from the car, drove me to my doctor appointments. The neighbors adored him. "What a fine young man," Mrs. Keller next door said. "You're lucky to have family visiting." I was lucky, or so I believed. Daniel talked often about wanting to preserve Uncle Edward's memory. He said he wanted to restore our old farmhouse, the one that had fallen into ruin after my parents died. "It's where our roots are," he told me one evening. "Family should stay connected to its roots. He spoke like a dreamer, full of sentiment and purpose. He even brought printed photos of the place, saying he'd visited the property and met with the local assessor about buying it back from the county. "I don't have the money yet," he confessed, his eyes downcast. "But I've been saving. I just wish I could bring it back before it's gone forever." Something inside me shifted that night. Maybe it was guilt that I'd let the family home rot. Guilt that I'd grown old and comfortable while everyone else vanished. I told him I had some savings, modest, but enough to help him start. "Oh, no," he said, shaking his head. "I can't take your money, Aunt Margaret." But his voice cracked when he said it. He wanted me to insist, and I did. Within a week, I'd written him a check for $25,000. "Just promise me," I said. "You'll use it wisely." He took my hands in his. "You have my word." He began calling every day after that, updating me about permits, about repairs, about contractors. His stories sounded so real that I even began imagining the smell of fresh paint, the creak of the porch steps being rebuilt. Months passed. Then one day, he called saying the restoration had hit a snag. The county demanded additional fees and taxes. He sounded desperate. I hesitated, but his voice was trembling. "If I can't make the payment by Friday," he said, "we'll lose the deed. All the work will be wasted." So I transferred another $40,000. I didn't tell anyone, not even my friend Lydia, who visited every Sunday with lemon cake and gossip. I was too proud to admit I'd become attached to a dream. By autumn, Daniel said the house was nearly finished. "You'll love it, Aunt Margaret," he said over the phone. "It's like time stood still. I even found an old swing in the barn, just like when you and Dad were kids." I smiled through tears. I can't wait to see it. He promised he'd drive me there in October. But October came and went, and there was always an excuse. The car broke down. The contractor delayed inspection, then silence. Days turned into weeks. My calls went unanswered. His number stopped working. I tried emailing him, but the messages bounced back. At first, I thought he'd been hurt. I even called the police, worried he might have had an accident. But when they traced the name and address he'd given me, nothing matched. No Daniel Reed, no property under that name, no record of a renovation. My blood ran cold. I went to my bank. The teller looked at me with pity when she said, "Ma'am, the transfers went to an account flagged for fraud." That was the moment the room spun. I remember gripping the counter, my legs shaking. He was my nephew," I whispered. The teller hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Whoever he wasn't family." That night, I sat alone in my dim living room, staring at the empty teacup he'd once used. His fingerprints were probably still there, mocking me. My chest ached, not just from loss, but from shame. Because deep down, I realized something unbearable. I hadn't just lost money. I'd lost trust. And yet, something still didn't fit. There were too many details he couldn't have faked. The names, the places, the letters. How did he know about the box under my bed? For days after that discovery, I barely slept. My mind kept running in circles, questioning every detail, every conversation, every moment I had shared with Daniel, the way he smiled when he first saw Edward's photo, the way his voice softened when he called me Aunt Margaret. It had all felt so genuine, so heartbreakingly familiar. But now, that same warmth made my stomach twist in disgust. I couldn't understand how anyone could fabricate something so personal. How could a stranger know intimate family secrets, things I hadn't told a soul in decades? I decided to retrace every step of his visit. I started with the letter box, the lace-covered wooden chest beneath my bed where I'd kept Edward's last letters. I pulled it out slowly, my fingers trembling. Inside were 4 yellowed envelopes tied together with a faded blue ribbon. They smelled faintly of dust and time. I untied them, half expecting to find something missing. But the letters were all there. Except one. The final one, the one Edward had written just a week before he died, was gone. My breath caught. I remembered showing it to Daniel one night by the fireplace. He'd read it aloud, softly, his voice quivering as he reached the final line. "Tell Margaret she'll always be my light." He'd looked up then, eyes wet, and whispered, "He must have loved you so much." I hadn't seen that letter since. That's when the panic turned into suspicion. Someone must have known where that box was hidden. Only one other person had been in that room besides me, and it was him. I went to the police again. The officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened patiently, but looked skeptical. "Ma'am," he said gently, "these scams are common. They target the elderly. They study public records, social media, obituaries, anything that helps them build trust. But how would he know about my brother's handwriting? About the box under my bed?" I argued. "He even knew our dog's name." The officer sighed. "Sometimes, ma'am, they find old newspaper clippings or talk to old neighbors. They piece things together. It feels real because they make it real." His words stung. I left the station with a hollow ache in my chest, clutching a police report that felt useless. Still, something inside me refused to believe Daniel was just another scammer. There was intent in his actions, not randomness. He wasn't only after money, he wanted me to believe he was family. And he'd succeeded. That night, as I sat alone by the fire, I stared at Edward's photograph, the one I kept on the mantel. It was taken in 1973, at our parents' anniversary. He was wearing his favorite tweed jacket, the same one Daniel had worn when he arrived at my door. A memory struck me sharp and cold. That jacket had been custom-made. Edward's initials were stitched inside the lining. I remembered Daniel saying, "This was my dad's old jacket. Mom kept it all these years." Could it be the same one? I rushed to my bedroom, flung open the wardrobe, and found Daniel's old duffel bag. He'd left it behind after his last visit, saying he'd come back for it later. I hadn't touched it since. My hands trembled as I unzipped it. Inside was a folded brown tweed jacket. The smell of mothballs and cologne hit me like a wave of nostalgia and nausea mixed together. I turned it inside out and froze. There they were, embroidered in fading thread. E.R. Edward Reed. My knees nearly gave out. Tears blurred my vision. That jacket hadn't seen daylight in 40 years. It was supposed to be in the attic, Locked away in an old trunk with my father's medals and mother's shawl, I climbed the attic stairs as fast as my body allowed. When I reached the trunk, my heart sank. The lock was broken. Inside, the contents were disturbed. Edward's letters, my mother's jewelry box, and a few photo albums were missing. I sank to the floor, sobbing. The man I'd trusted, the man who'd called me Aunt Margaret, had broken into my home long before he pretended to find me. He must have stolen those things weeks before introducing himself. That's how he knew everything. The betrayal cut deeper than I could bear. He hadn't just taken my savings, he had used my memories, twisted them into a weapon. I called the police again, gave them the new evidence, the jacket, the broken trunk, the missing letters. This time, they took it seriously. They opened a case for identity fraud and theft, promising to trace the bank accounts and the fingerprints on the duffel bag. But weeks passed, and every phone call ended the same way. "We're still investigating, ma'am." My nights became endless loops of guilt and fury. I kept replaying every conversation with him, how he'd kissed my forehead before leaving, how he'd said, "You remind me of Dad when you smile." The words, once sweet, now felt poisonous. One afternoon, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the garden. That's when Lydia arrived. Her voice was the same mix of cheer and curiosity it always was. "Margaret, you look pale. Are you all right?" I broke down right there, telling her everything from Daniel's arrival to the theft. She listened silently, her expression tightening with every word. When I finished, she said something that made my heart skip. "Wait, Daniel Reed, you said? Tall, dark hair, polite voice?" "Yes," I whispered. She frowned. "That name sounds familiar. A man with that name came to the church last month. Said he was collecting donations for family restoration projects. I gave him $50. My blood ran cold." She continued. "He had a small scar under his chin. Said his aunt was helping him restore their old home too." That detail, the scar. Daniel had one just like that. He was still out there, using my name, using my story. I felt sick, furious, determined. That night, I went through Edward's things again, hoping for any clue that could connect Daniel to someone real. That's when I found an old photograph tucked behind another frame. It showed Edward with a woman and a baby maybe 6 months old. The woman wasn't his wife. On the back, written in Edward's handwriting, were the words, "For Margaret, someday you'll understand." My heart pounded. Could it be that Edward had a child after all? I stared at the baby's face. The eyes, the hair, even the shape of the chin, it all matched Daniel's. My tears came harder this time, not from betrayal, but confusion. Had I been wrong all along? Had Daniel truly been Edward's son, but driven by some twisted motive I didn't yet understand? I clutched the photo to my chest, whispering through sobs, "Who are you, Daniel?" Somewhere deep inside, a new fear began to bloom, one darker than before. What if Daniel hadn't just come for the money? What if he'd come for something else, something buried long ago with my brother's secrets? Sleep would not come, so I sat with the photograph under the yellow lamplight, tracing the soft edge of the paper with my thumb until it began to fray. The baby's face was round and solemn, a tiny hand curled like a question mark against the woman's blouse. Edward stood beside them, not touching, but angled in a way that confessed more than a lover's grip ever could. His smile was shy. His eyes, those familiar, laughing eyes, looked almost apologetic. Morning peeled itself out of the night with a tired grayness. I dressed slowly, put the picture in my purse, and phoned Lydia. "I need to go somewhere," I told her. "Not the police. Not yet." She arrived within 15 minutes, hair pinned back, mouth tight with concern, a thermos of coffee under her arm like a soldier's canteen. "Where?" she asked. "The church," I said. "You said he came there." Pastor Williams greeted us with the careful warmth of a man who has answered grief 1,000 times. When I told him Daniel had stolen from me, his eyes softened. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," he said, ushering us into the small office that smelled of old books and lemon cleaner. "Do you keep records of donations?" Lydia asked. "Do you have a sign-in sheet for visitors?" He did. He brought out a thin binder and set it before us. My breath caught at the familiar handwriting, bold loops, careful angles. Daniel had written his name as neatly as a schoolboy, Daniel Reed. Next to it, a phone number, and a note in the margin, "Restoring my late father's ancestral home." "That number doesn't work anymore," I said. The pastor frowned. "He came with a woman once," he added thoughtfully. "An older woman. Not elderly, but weathered. She had a cigarette voice and a scarf with small violets on it. He called her Cora." "His mother?" I asked. "He called her Aunt Cora." We stepped back into the cold corridor. Lydia's hand found my arm. Aunt Cora. He was practicing the same lie with someone else. Or telling a truth I didn't know how to reach. On impulse, I took out the photograph and showed it to the pastor. "Do you recognize her?" He studied the woman in the picture, then shook his head. "But there's a photographer's stamp," he said, tapping the back where faint ink still ghosted the paper. "Dawson and Son Studio. That was near the old hospital. They closed years ago." We drove to the shuttered storefront anyway. The windows were dusty, the door chained. Next door, a clock repair shop still clung to life. The shopkeeper, a fragile man with careful hands, glanced at the photo and smiled wistfully. "Dawson's daughter still lives around here. She kept some of the records. In the attic, probably." I don't know how many doors we knocked on before we found her a woman with soft gray hair and surprised eyes. The name Ellen Dawson was stitched on her cardigan. She took one look at the photo and her face opened like a book. "Goodness," she murmured. "That paper, that border, we used that stock for hospital photos. New mothers. Sometimes visiting families." "Do you have the ledger?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She hesitated, then disappeared upstairs and returned with a cracked blue-covered book. Its pages smelled like starch and history. We found it. The date, close to the winter before Edward died. A notation. "Special request, no studio name," printed on the front. Beside it, 3 letters, E.R., and a woman's name I had never seen before, L. Hale. "Hale," Lydia read aloud slowly. "Not his wife's name." "No," I said, my heart beginning to pound. But I know a Hale. The police officer who had taken my report, his name badge had read Hale. The memory rang through me like a bell. By the time we reached the station, the air had turned brittle and bright. Officer Hale looked tired, same as before, but when I showed him the ledger entry, something in his posture shifted. He excused himself, spoke to a colleague, then returned with a folder he had not let me see on previous visits. My late mother's name was Lorraine Hale, he said slowly. When I started on the force, folks sometimes asked if I was related to a Lorraine who'd worked as a nurse's aide at Street Michael's back in the 70s. I wasn't. We only shared a last name, but I do know she moved in circles. Complicated ones. He thumbed through a photocopied newspaper clipping, then placed it gently on the desk. This is from 1978, 2 years before your brother died. There was a minor article about a missing woman named Lorraine Hale. She turned up weeks later, alive. No charges, but there were rumors about a baby. My fingers twitched toward the photo in my purse. A baby, I whispered. He asked if he could copy the photograph, and I allowed it, my hands shaking. I'll see what I can dig up, he said, and for the first time since the man had vanished, I felt something like a door unlatch inside me. Lydia and I drove home in silence. The sky was a pale coin. Every fence post, every mailbox felt like a witness to something I had missed while I was busy growing old. We were 3 streets from my house when Lydia suddenly braked. What? She pointed. There, parked 2 blocks down from my home, was a dull green sedan I had seen once before the week Daniel began to distance himself. A man sat inside with a cap brim low. His fingers drummed the steering wheel. When he noticed us slowing, he turned the key. The car coughed, then pulled away smoothly, like a fish sliding deeper into dark water. "Follow him," I said. "Margaret, please." She did. But we lost him at a 4-way stop I had driven through 1,000 times without thinking. The absence of him in that moment felt like a bruise someone pressed a thumb into. We parked by the curb where the car had vanished, and I stared at the intersection's empty geometry, the crisscross of common choices, the countless unremarkable passers-by, and wondered how many times I had been watched without knowing. "That jacket in your attic," Lydia said softly, as if reading my mind. "He left it where you'd find it. Either he wanted you to know, or he wanted to taunt you. Or he wanted to tell me something and didn't know how," I said, surprised to hear the tenderness still lingering in my chest for a man who had robbed me blind. When we returned to my porch, an envelope was waiting under the mat. No stamp, no address. Inside was my missing letter from Edward, the last one. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. There was a fresh crease that had not been there before, as if someone else had read it repeatedly, wearing the fold with hope or hunger. I read aloud to Lydia until my voice cracked. The last lines were ones I knew. "Tell Margaret she'll always be my light." But before that, a passage I had somehow forgotten in the years since. "There's something I haven't told you, Meg. If I don't come back, know that I tried to do right by everyone. I'm caring for a little life that wasn't planned but feels like grace. One day, that child may need you. Don't shut the door." The words rocked my bones. Lydia wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "He had a child. she whispered, "and he thought I could be—" "What?" "A refuge." I ran a finger over the faded ink. Why wouldn't he tell me more? Maybe because, even then, shame and fear had hands on his throat. The phone rang. I nearly didn't answer it. Fear had begun living in the wires of the house, but Lydia nudged the receiver toward me. "You should." A woman's voice emerged, hushed and cautious. "Is this Margaret Reed?" "Yes." A pause then. "My name is Cora. You don't know me, but I know the man you're looking for." My lungs tightened. "Daniel?" Another pause. "He isn't Daniel," she said. "Not really. He uses that name because it's kinder than the names he was given." She exhaled, a sound like a cigarette being put out. "He's hurt a lot of people. But before you hang up, you need to hear this. He truly believed you abandoned him." I sat down hard. Lydia leaned closer, her eyes wide. "The photograph," I said. "The baby Edward's child?" On the other end, a wavering inhale. The baby was placed quietly. It was a different time. Papers were changed, promises made, and a boy grew up passing through houses that called themselves homes. Her voice softened. "When I met him, he had your brother's jacket and a letter he read until the paper started to break. He showed me your address like it was a map back to something good. He said, 'She'll know me. She'll claim me.' My throat burned. And then he took my money. And then he took your money," she agreed flatly, "because what he knows best is survival. He wore love like a disguise, and then forgot it was still on his face." "Where is he?" I asked. "Please." A long silence stitched the distance between our breaths. "At a motel off Route 7, she said at last. "Room 16. If you go, don't go alone. He can be tender as a promise and mean as a wound. Sometimes in the same hour." She gave the name of the place and hung up before I could say thank you. Lydia stood, already reaching for her keys. "We're not driving there by ourselves," she said. "We'll call Officer Hale. We'll do it the right way." I nodded, but my heart had already leapt ahead of me, racing down a ribbon of asphalt toward a door with peeling paint and a boy I could not stop imagining small, solemn, waiting for someone to claim him. As we dialed, another thought took root, fragile and dangerous. What if the theft was not the final act, but only the beginning of a confession that neither of us, not even Edward's ghost, knew how to finish? Outside, the wind rose, tugging at the chimes. The house listened with me. The line began to ring, and somewhere a man who had called me Aunt Margaret turned perhaps for the first time toward the truth he had been dodging his whole life. The night we drove to the motel, the rain came down like it had been waiting all season for this moment. The windshield wipers thumped a nervous rhythm as Lydia gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the dashboard's dim glow. Officer Hale followed close behind us in his cruiser, headlights cutting through the fog like twin spears of judgment. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, Edward's letter pressed against my chest beneath my coat. The paper felt like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. Every few minutes, Lydia would glance at me, her lips parting to speak, then closing again. There was nothing left to say. The silence between us was heavy enough to bruise. When we pulled into the motel parking lot, The air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and cigarette smoke. The neon sign flickered, half dead, spelling Mountain View Inn, though there wasn't a mountain in sight. Hale motioned for us to wait as he stepped out first, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Stay here," he ordered gently. But my hand was already on the door handle. "Margaret, I've been waiting 40 years to understand what happened to my brother's child," I whispered. "I'm not staying in the car." Hale sighed, then nodded. Lydia followed close behind me, holding her umbrella over both our heads as the rain poured harder. The air felt electric, every drop striking like a drum beat, counting down to revelation. Room 16 was at the far end, its number slightly crooked, the paint chipped away at the edges. Light leaked through the curtains, thin, nervous light that trembled when the wind blew. Hale knocked twice. For a long moment, nothing. Then the lock clicked. The door opened halfway, and there he was. Daniel, or whatever his real name was, stood barefoot, his hair disheveled, eyes red and hollow like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. When his gaze fell on me, his face changed, a flicker of shock, then guilt, then something softer, recognition maybe. "Aunt Margaret," he breathed. Hale stepped forward. "Sir, my name's Officer Hale. We need to talk." Daniel's shoulders slumped. He didn't resist when Hale entered. He just moved aside, glancing at me as if waiting for permission to speak. The small room smelled of damp carpet and instant coffee. On the table lay a half-open duffel bag, the same one he'd left at my house, and beside it, the missing photograph. My brother, the woman, the baby. "You kept it," I said quietly. He rubbed his face. "It's the only real thing I ever had." Hale began asking questions, his full name, his mother's name, where he'd been the last few months, but Daniel's answers came in broken pieces. He called himself David, not Daniel, said he'd grown up in foster homes, sometimes with a woman named Cora Hale, who wasn't his blood aunt but a caretaker who drifted in and out of shelters. "When I was 12, he said, his voice hoarse, "I found a box in one of her closets. Inside was a jacket with initials E.R. and a letter that said, 'Tell Margaret she'll always be my light.' Cora said it belonged to my father, Edward Reed. She told me he died before I was born. I didn't believe her. But then I found his name in the archives. Your address was on an envelope tucked inside. I felt my heart twist, and you came to me. I came because I wanted to know if someone out there could love me without needing proof first." His eyes shimmered. "But when I saw how kind you were, how much you trusted me, I panicked. I thought if you knew what I'd done to survive, you'd turn me away too. So I lied. I told myself if I could give you something, a restored house, a dream you'd forgive everything." Hale frowned. "And the money? The fake property?" David's face crumpled. "It started as a lie, but I swear I meant to give it back. I didn't know how to stop pretending. Every time she called me family, I felt alive for the first time in years. I wanted to be furious. I wanted to scream, to throw every bitter word in his face. But looking at him, I saw Edward's shadow, the same sad slope of the shoulders, the same way he bit his lip when afraid. My heart betrayed my anger. You had his eyes, I whispered. He looked down. I didn't mean to hurt you, Aunt Margaret. The word aunt fell differently now, no longer a manipulation but a plea. Hale cleared his throat. David, we'll need to take your statement at the station. There are still charges, fraud, theft, serious ones? David nodded, not fighting it. I know. Just let me say goodbye to her first. Hale hesitated, then stepped outside the door to call for backup. Lydia gave me a small nod and followed him out, leaving us alone. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain softened, replaced by the faint hum of an old refrigerator. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I finally asked. Because I wasn't sure I deserved to, he said. You looked at me like I was someone worth saving, and I wanted to stay that person a little longer. You could have been, I whispered. You still can. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. People don't change that easily, Aunt Margaret. Then maybe you're looking at the wrong people, I said. Your father wasn't perfect either, you know. He made mistakes, big ones, but he tried to make them right before he died. That letter wasn't just for me. It was for you. He turned toward me, eyes wide. He knew about me. Yes, I said softly. He called you a little life that wasn't planned but felt like grace. He wanted me to take you in if anything ever happened to him. But I never knew you existed, David. No one told me. By the time I found out he'd died, the trail was gone. He covered his mouth with a trembling hand, as if holding in years of silence. All this time, I thought you knew and didn't want me. I reached out, touching his arm. No, my dear. You were never unwanted. A tear slipped down his cheek. Then why does it hurt so much to be forgiven? Before I could answer, Hale returned. Another officer waited at the door. It's time, he said gently. David nodded. He picked up the jacket, Edward's jacket, and folded it carefully, like a relic. Then he looked at me one last time. Keep the letter. I don't need it anymore. I know now he meant it for both of us. As they led him away, I stood at the doorway, rain splashing my shoes. He didn't look back, but I watched until the cruiser disappeared into the mist. Lydia came beside me, placing her arm around my shoulders. You did the right thing, she whispered. I don't know if there's a right thing when it comes to family, I murmured. There's only what's left after the damage. We drove home in silence again, but this time the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt like rest. The storm had passed, and though the world outside was drenched, something inside me had finally started to dry. When I reached my porch, I looked up at the dark sky and whispered to the wind, He found me, Edward. He finally found me. And for the first time in months, I slept without dreams. When I woke the next morning, the world outside my window seemed painfully calm. The storm had left behind puddles that caught the sunlight like glass bowls, glimmering as if to mock the chaos inside me. My first thought was of David, of that lost boy's face as the police led him away, his eyes hollow yet oddly peaceful, as though the burden of pretending had finally lifted. I made my tea the way I always did, 1 sugar, no milk, but it tasted different, like the world had tilted slightly on its axis. The house was silent, every creak of the floorboards echoing the absence he'd left behind. I glanced at the mantel where Edward's photograph still stood, and next to it I placed David's duffel bag. It was lighter now. I'd kept only the jacket folded neatly inside and the letter that had started everything. By afternoon, the phone rang. It was Officer Hale. His voice sounded softer than before, the tone of a man trying to prepare me gently. "We brought him in last night. He gave a full statement," he said. "It seems your instincts were right. He's your brother's son. The DNA test will take time, but the documents he carried, the dates, the photos, everything lines up." I sat down slowly, the edge of the table pressing into my palm. "So Edward really did have a child?" "Yes," Hale said, "but there's more. It seems your brother's death wasn't exactly an accident." The words dropped like stones in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "There are old records reports that were never filed properly. Witness statements from a mechanic who saw your brother arguing with someone near his car before the crash. The man's description matches Lorraine Hale's boyfriend at the time. It appears Edward was trying to retrieve the baby from her. He might have been forced off the road." I pressed the receiver to my ear, my breath coming shallow. "All these years, and no one told me?" "It was a different time, Margaret," Hale said gently. "People covered up what they couldn't face. Your brother wanted to protect you. He thought silence was mercy." After we hung up, I sat in the stillness for what felt like hours. The truth was heavier than grief. It carried a strange clarity, like light seeping through a cracked window. Edward had tried to do right by everyone, but fate had punished him for loving too deeply. And David, that broken remnant of his love, had inherited not his kindness, but his guilt. That evening, Lydia came by with soup and worry etched across her forehead. "The paper's already running the story," she said, handing me a folded copy of the Evening Chronicle. The headline read, "Local man posed as nephew, turns out to be real one." I traced the bold letters with trembling fingers. Beneath them was a photograph of David being led out of the motel, his face partly turned away. To anyone else, he was a criminal. To me, he was the last piece of Edward's unfinished story. The phone rang again just before dusk. It was Officer Hale once more. "He wants to see you," he said quietly. "He's being transferred tomorrow. He asked for you by name." I hesitated. My heart ached, torn between love and betrayal, forgiveness and fear. "Do you think I should go?" Hale paused. "I think closure is a mercy both of you deserve." The county jail was cold and sterile, the kind of place that drained the world of color. When I entered the visiting room, David was already sitting on the other side of the glass, his hands clasped together, eyes searching the floor until he saw me. He smiled faintly, a fragile thing. "You came," he said through the phone. "I did." He looked thinner, smaller somehow, as if the walls had been pressing in on him. "I told them everything," he said. "About the money, the lies. I'll serve my time. Maybe that's what I need." "You don't need punishment," I said softly. "You need peace." He gave a bitter laugh. "Peace doesn't come easy to people like me." "Then let me help you find it," I said. "You're not alone anymore, David. Do you understand that? You have a family, even if it's just an old woman who talks too much and makes terrible tea. That almost made him laugh for real. "You sound like my father," he said quietly. "I suppose I do." I pressed my hand against the glass. He hesitated, then mirrored it with his own, our palms separated only by that thin, cold barrier. "He would have been proud of you," I whispered. Tears welled in his eyes. "Even after everything I did?" "Yes, because you finally stopped running." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The world seemed to shrink to that narrow space between our fingertips, that fragile illusion of touch. Then a guard appeared, signaling the end of visiting hours. David wiped his eyes quickly, forcing a smile. "Promise me something," he said. "Keep the jacket. Don't throw it away. It belongs where it's loved." "I will," I said, "and when you get out, you'll come home to it." He nodded, his mouth trembling. "Home," he repeated softly, like it was a word he hadn't dared to use in years. When I stepped back into the evening air, I felt lighter, as though the weight of 40 years had finally shifted off my shoulders. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, and for the first time since Edward's death, I didn't feel alone under it. Days turned into weeks. The police closed the case. The bank managed to recover a small portion of the stolen funds, and neighbors began dropping by again, some with pity, others with curiosity. I didn't mind. The story they'd read in the paper was only a fraction of the truth, and the rest belonged to me and my brother's son. Lydia came over one Sunday with a box of family photos we'd dug out from my attic. "You should start putting these together," she said. "For him, for when he gets out." I smiled faintly. "I already have." We spent the afternoon sorting through decades of faces, my parents, Edward, even Jasper the dog. I tucked the photo of baby David among them, right beside Edward's wedding picture. For once, the story looked whole. That night, I sat by the window, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight. The house was quiet, but not empty. I could almost hear Edward's laughter in the distance, feel the echo of his promise. "Tell Margaret she'll always be my light," I whispered into the darkness. "And now I'll be his son's." And as the wind carried the words away, I realized forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a lifelong tending, like keeping a lamp burning through every storm, waiting for the lost to find their way home. Spring came quietly that year, the kind that crept in with soft rains and shy sunlight, washing away the gray ghosts of winter. The tulips in my garden bloomed earlier than expected, red and gold against the tired soil, and for the first time in years, I found myself tending to them with steady hands. I'd stopped expecting miracles at my age, but life, it seemed, wasn't done surprising me. Every Sunday, I'd receive a letter from the correctional facility, always written in careful, deliberate script, David's handwriting. The first letters were awkward, guilt-ridden, full of apologies and half-finished sentences, but with time, they grew warmer. He wrote about the books he was reading, the counseling sessions he'd begun, the volunteer work he was doing with other inmates. He always ended the same way. "I'm learning how to be someone who deserves forgiveness." I kept each letter tied with a blue ribbon in the same lace box where Edward's had once been. I sometimes caught myself talking to that box out loud, as if my brother and his son were both listening somehow. "He's trying, Edward," I'd whisper. "He's finding his way." 3 months after our last visit, Officer Hale called again. "He's being moved to a work release program," he said. "It's part of his rehabilitation. He's kept his record clean, attends every session, mentors others. The warden says he's a model inmate." I smiled faintly. "He's his father's son, then?" "Yes," Hale said. "I think he finally believes that." After the call, I sat for a long while in my kitchen, staring at the steam curling from my teacup. I thought about the arc of it all, the little boy who'd been abandoned, the woman who'd spent decades mourning a brother she never truly knew, and how fate, cruel as it was, had somehow braided their broken stories together. Weeks passed. The town forgot the scandal, as small towns always do. The gossip that once filled every porch faded into new whispers about someone else's misfortune. Lydia still came by every Thursday, bringing muffins and her usual fussing. She'd become my anchor in the chaos, sharp-tongued and loyal as ever. "You've aged backward," she teased one morning as I trimmed the roses. "Must be the joy of adopting criminals. Only the ones who steal my savings and return my heart," I said, smiling. We laughed until our sides hurt. For the first time in a long time, laughter didn't feel borrowed, it felt earned. Then, one morning in early June, a letter arrived unlike the others. The envelope was thicker, heavier. My heart fluttered as I opened it. Inside was a single page, and a photograph clipped to the corner. The photo showed David standing in front of a half-restored house, the old Reed farmhouse. The porch had been rebuilt, the windows polished, the same wooden swing hanging under the eaves. His smile was small, uncertain, but it was real. Beneath it, in neat writing, he'd penned, "It's ours again, Aunt Margaret. I'm bringing it back to life one nail at a time." Tears blurred the ink. I traced the photo with my fingertips, remembering the day he'd first spoken of that dream, the same dream I'd foolishly believed was a lie. Maybe it had been then, but now it was true. In the letter, he wrote, "They let us work on community restoration projects. I asked for this one. The county approved it. Every day I stand in that old place. I feel him there, my father. It's strange, but I think he forgave me long before I forgave myself. When I'm done, I want you to see it. Maybe we could sit on the porch together, like family." By the time I finished reading, I was crying so hard the paper shook. Lydia found me that afternoon, and when she saw the letter, she didn't ask a thing, she just hugged me. The months that followed moved like a quiet hymn. Each week, another letter, another update. A new beam, a new window, a new memory reclaimed from the dust. Then, one golden September morning, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was deeper now, steadier, but unmistakable. "Aunt Margaret," he said softly, "I'm coming home." I didn't realize I was crying until my hands began to shake. "Oh, my boy," I whispered, "your father would be so proud." He laughed, a sound filled with both joy and disbelief. "I hope so. I've spent my whole life trying to become the man I thought he was." "No," I said. "Become better." That's how you honor him. The day he arrived, the air smelled of pine and rain-soaked earth. I waited on the porch with 2 mugs of tea, the kind Edward and I used to drink after chores. When I saw the car stop at the gate, my knees almost gave out. He stepped out slowly, wearing a clean shirt, the old tweed jacket slung over his arm. His face was leaner, wiser. There were lines around his eyes, now honest lines, the kind earned from learning the hard way. For a moment we simply stood there, the distance between us shimmering with everything unspoken. Then he walked up the path, and I opened my arms. He didn't hesitate. When he hugged me, it wasn't the tentative embrace of a man pretending anymore. It was the full, trembling grip of a son finding his way home. "I'm sorry," he whispered against my shoulder. "I know," I said, "but you came back. That's what matters." We sat on the porch until twilight, sipping tea and listening to the crickets. He told me about his plans to keep restoring the farmhouse, to open it as a shelter for boys who'd grown up like him, lost between systems and second chances. "I want to name it the Reed House," he said. "For family, for roots, for you." My eyes blurred again. "That's beautiful," I murmured. "Edward would have loved that." He smiled. "Then I'll do it for both of you." As the sun dipped behind the trees, I reached into my pocket and handed him the letter, Edward's final one. "It belongs to you now," I said. He wrote it for us both. He unfolded it carefully, reading the words under his breath, and when he reached the final line, his voice broke. "Tell Margaret she'll always be my light," he whispered. Then, looking at me with tears shining in his eyes, he added softly, "And she was mine too." The crickets kept singing. The porch creaked under our rocking chairs. Somewhere I imagined Edward smiling, his laughter carried on the evening wind. The world was quiet, gentle, whole, and as the first stars appeared, I realized the truth. Family isn't just the blood that binds us, but the forgiveness that saves us. David looked up at the sky and said, almost to himself, "He would have wanted this." "Yes," I replied, closing my eyes against the warmth of the fading light. "And now he finally has it." The night wrapped around us like a soft blanket, and for the first time in 40 years, the Reed family was home again.